And then you had to say to yourself as a defense attorney, what do I do with it? And you can't listen to everybody else, and you can't listen to the media, and you can't listen to the scandal mongers. You got to figure out for yourself, based on the facts, the evidence, what you know about your client and the witnesses, what you think is going on. Now, I didn't raise a racial issue. I didn't think he was prosecuted because of his race. I thought he was prosecuted because he was a mega celebrity. I will say this. The last witness I called was actor-comedian Chris Tucker. And Chris Tucker testified that this family who was accusing Michael Jackson had tried to hustle him. They wanted his car. They told him the child had cancer, like Michael Jackson was told. He invited them to a day in Las Vegas where they were filming the film Rush Hour 1. They stayed 3 weeks and billed him for everything. They kept asking him for money, and he flew to Miami, and he met Michael Jackson at a hotel, and he said, "Be careful, something is wrong." He warned Michael Jackson about this accuser and his family. On cross-examination, the district attorney, Tom Mesereau, conducted the cross. And at one point, he showed Chris Tucker a blow-up of a photograph of Chris with the accuser and his family at a wedding. And Chris rather humorously said, "I like that picture, you know where I can get it?" And everybody kind of chuckled in the courtroom. The DA looked at him and said, "I'll get it for you if you're a good boy." Now, the African American community, as far as I can tell, and I was not watching the media all the time, I was working most of the time, I would take a break and channel surf to see what I could see, didn't pick up on this very much, and I was happy. Because again, coming back to my defense, my belief in what would work, I didn't want to raise issues of racism in this case. I looked at this jury, I felt this jury, I didn't think it would help us. And I had to take a very difficult and controversial position at the end of the case because of my belief in what was necessary to save my client, Michael Jackson. The day the jury got the case, I felt very good. I felt our case had gone in very well. And I had told certain people, I don't want a racial issue here. I don't want to be identified with a racial issue in this community. I don't think it's going to help us. At the beginning of the case, when I was asked by various people associated with Michael Jackson how I thought things were going, I had been very concerned. And let me sort of explain that this way. In November of 2003, Neverland was raided by 70 sheriffs. And I was called, I was driving back from Big Sur, California to Los Angeles. I'd taken a vacation. I was asked if I would fly to Las Vegas to meet Michael Jackson, that he wanted me to represent him. And I thought about it long and hard, and I declined, because I was getting ready to defend actor Robert Blake in his homicide case, which was set for trial in February of 2004, and I didn't think I could do justice to both cases. I thought it would just drive both clients crazy if I was not available when they needed me. And Michael's people were quite surprised that anybody would say no, but I did. When Blake and I had a falling out approximately 10 days before the start of his trial in February, and I withdrew, I got a call about a month and a half later by Randy Jackson, Michael's brother, who's been a friend of mine for many years. Would I reconsider, would I fly to Florida and meet him? I said I would. I went down and met Michael, flew back, was asked in a short, 5 or 6 days later, will I come back? I said I would, and I was retained. But what I had seen before I was retained on TV was of great concern to me. You may recall that first arraignment. I was not his lawyer then. First of all, Nation of Islam were providing security for Michael, and they were very prominent in Santa Maria at that first arraignment. Now, I've worked with Nation of Islam for many years, and I still do. And I've agreed to defend their Western regional leader if he is charged with assaulting a police officer, which they're threatening to do, but haven't done yet. And I am well aware of what Nation of Islam does in the inner city in Los Angeles, the way they fight gang violence, the way they fight drugs, the way they try and teach people responsibility and spirituality, and they do so much in a city which is the gang capital of America to try and stop this violence. And I had worked with the Nation of Islam in the Patricia Moore case. They have been great supporters of her. But nevertheless, I did not think having Nation of Islam in that prominent position as Michael's security people in Santa Maria were helping him defend. I felt it was separating him more from the community that was going to judge him rather than making him part of the community that he had chosen to live in that would judge him. And I made that very clear. This is not a good way to start. I also had seen his lawyers and advisors in a meeting at the Beverly Hills Hotel, a very posh hotel in Los Angeles. They had a meeting and it was all over the news how all these fat cats who advised Michael Jackson were, at this hotel assembled to put together a defense. And they used the word dream team. And I said to myself as I watched the news, this is wrong. This is not helping Michael in this community. It's separating Michael from this community. Emphasize that he's one of the people around this courthouse. Don't emphasize that he's separate or bigger or completely different from those people, because he's not. And I voiced my feelings about that. I looked at it purely in terms of what would help him, not in terms of necessarily what would create a political statement or the appropriate moral statement. I looked at it in terms of how do I save the life of Michael Jackson. And you may recall, if you followed the case, that during the second arraignment, after he was indicted, when I was his lawyer, you didn't see Nation of Islam prominent. You had certainly some Muslim security, but it wasn't a prominent thing. And there were no more parties at Neverland and no more summit meetings in Beverly Hills and things of that sort. It wasn't going to help defend Michael. But at the end of the case, and unfortunately this got some TV coverage, and I'll just be perfectly honest about it, the Reverend Jesse Jackson, who I have a lot of respect for, particularly what he did during the Civil Rights Movement and what he's done since, did appear. And I was upset. And I issued a press release that nobody's speaking for Michael Jackson or the family, that there's a gag order, we will honor it. And I had a talk with the Reverend Jackson, and I explained to him just what I'm explaining to you. There's no upside here. To a lot of white people, when they see you, they think there's a racial divide or there's a racial issue that you're coming to expose and to fight against, as you should, but it's not going to help me with my job right now. And he did leave. He was there for a couple of days. He understood my goals. He understood my motives. I still have great respect for him, but I didn't want him there at that time, for the reasons I've told you about. Now, I was asked if I wanted Al Sharpton to come up to the community. And I suggested that wouldn't be a good idea either, and he completely understood. He didn't think he belonged there either. But it's up to the defense attorney to identify these issues for what they are. See them realistically. Don't hide from what they are. And don't pretend our society is something it's not, and don't pretend the community where you're trying the case is something it's not. Be aware of what it is and adjust your defense accordingly. And that was what I was trying to do. Fortunately, we succeeded. And I absolutely believe justice was done. I know we have a lot of students here who are studying trial tactics. Let me say a couple of things about trial tactics, because I did pursue some unorthodox trial tactics in the case for which I was criticized until the verdicts. And I'll just summarize them very, very quickly. A trial is an exercise in people. If you don't understand people, you're not as equipped to try a case as you could be. You don't learn about people in law school. You really don't. In fact, you learn in law school, in my opinion, that everything is an intellectual exercise. And it's not. I think the best trial lawyers understand what happens in their heart and their soul as much as what happens in their intellect. And if they're going to communicate with people who didn't go to law school and didn't go to college and come from different walks of life, some highly educated, some not, whoever they may be, you have to learn that there's a lot more to human nature than your intellect. And you have to learn what makes people tick. You have to learn who is the kind of person that typically resonates with you as the trial lawyer. You only learn that with experience. And you have to learn about people's intuitions, their instincts, their feel. Everything is not intellectual, trust me. And I really think that law schools do a disservice when they don't train trial lawyers to be good people. I often talk about the value of pro bono work because I thoroughly believe in it and I do it. And a lot of law students look at me like, what is he talking about? I'm in debt, I'm struggling, I can't pay the rent, I want a new car, this big job has been offered to me, are you nuts? You know. And I can't tell anybody how to live their life. Only you can figure out what works for you. And we can't do everything in our short lives. We have to balance things out as best we can. But I will say this. Ever since I was in law school, every study I've shown about lawyer satisfaction is alarming. Every study I've seen indicates that the vast majority of lawyers are not happy in their work. And they seem to accept that as unchangeable. And what I've observed is very much the following. I see lawyers, particularly smart ones from good schools with good academic backgrounds, take very prestigious jobs. And after the allure sort of rubs off, they're unhappy and they move to another prestigious job. And then they move to another prestigious job. And it never dawns on them they're changing jobs without changing them at all. And many of them just eventually settle for making a tremendous amount of money in a prestige institution, and they're not terribly satisfied. There'll be some other adjustments more radical than that. You'll see lawyers go to the U.S. Attorney's Office, where everybody has a pretty much of an elitist kind of attitude about what they're doing, and then they'll jump from a prestige firm to the U.S. Attorney's Office and then back to a prestige firm, and then you'll get them, you know, in a bar one night having a third or fourth drink, and they'll say, I don't like what I do, you know, but they're not going to change it. They're on a treadmill. Well, you know, there's a lawyer who passed away 10 years ago named William Kunstler, and he wrote a wonderful book called My Life as a Radical Lawyer, which he published a year before his death in 1994. And I would urge everyone to read it. It's a fascinating book. Now, you know, he liked to embellish, you know, the myth of who Bill Kunstler was, and he was known to exaggerate a little bit, as the co-author says in her introduction. But nevertheless, he's a guy who did everything right, quote unquote. He graduated Phi Beta Kappa from Yale, majored in French, later taught at Yale. He had a distinguished World War II record. He went to Columbia Law School. He formed a firm with his brother in downtown Manhattan. He bought a nice home in Westchester, and he was doing everything right, except that none of it felt very satisfying to him. And someone from the ACLU called him one day and said, we have a civil rights case in the Deep South. Could you help us out with it? And he said he would, and he began to work with Martin Luther King Jr. in the South, and he just became enmeshed in the civil rights movement in the South. He became nationally famous in the Chicago 7 trial in the late 60s, which had to do with whether or not the defendants incited a riot out in front of the Democratic National Convention in '68. He decided to devote his career to defending pariahs, people who nobody else would touch. He almost relished in the idea of defending people that seemed defenseless. At the end of his life, he began to focus his attention more on Arab Americans who he thought, in light of the 1993 bombing in New York, were now becoming the real target class for racism and injustice and bigotry. And by all accounts, he lived a very, very exciting, colorful, satisfying life as a lawyer. A couple of years after he died, a law professor in Alabama wrote a book called William Kunstler, the Most Hated Lawyer in America. And he analyzed his life from his perspective and really came to the conclusion that this was a satisfied lawyer. This was a lawyer who felt he had made a difference, who had affected society, who had found satisfaction in his work, who felt he had taken his law degree and really done something meaningful, had made the justice system work where it wouldn't have worked at all. I was talking to Professor Ogletree earlier today about a famous trial lawyer from Chicago who lived much earlier than William Kunstler, named Clarence Darrow, who many of you may have heard about. Well, Clarence Darrow, at one point in his career, was doing everything right. He was corporation counsel for the city of Chicago, which at the time was thought to be a great springboard to fame and fortune. He was general counsel of a railroad in Illinois, which was also portrayed to be the same. It just wasn't enough. And he began to represent labor unions at a time when people associated with labor unions were considered criminals. They were considered to be criminal organizations, much like the mafia at a later time. He found great satisfaction doing pro bono work. He made a tremendous impact on society, and by all
To my friends and fans, thank you very much for all of your support. Together, we will see this through to the very end.